everybody, so with the release of Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, we now have 7 movies in the Mission Impossible franchise, and what a franchise Mission Impossible is. It's probably my favorite ongoing action movie franchise. It's been a huge part of my life for almost 30 years now. Who would have guessed what originally started as a continuation in film of the Mission Impossible TV show of the 60s would be one of the best ongoing franchises of all time with Tom Cruise at the lead. Of course, this is just my personal ranking of all the films in the franchise so far, so make sure you share your ranking in the comment section down below, but let's get into my ranking of the franchise. In 7th place, I have Mission Impossible 2. This entry is kind of the black sheep of the franchise. I've always tried, every time I've rewatched the second film, to like it a bit more, but I've always come away with it as it's kind of a mixed bag. It's drastically different than the first Mission Impossible film, which still is jarring even on rewatch. John Woo is an amazing director, and in hindsight, you would think that would be an exciting choice for a Mission Impossible film just due to his background. And some of the action and the stunts in Mission Impossible 2 are fun enough. You've got your usual staples of John Woo, the doves, the slow-mo. I quite like the motorcycle chase and when Ethan fights Ambrose, the knife stunt that we all know about, but it's very light on action, which is very weird for a Mission Impossible film. You don't get a whole lot of it until the third act, and then by then, I kind of was checked out a little bit. Mainly due to a lackluster story that moves at a glacial pace, and the cast here probably is my least favorite cast amongst all the films. It isn't helped either by the weakest antagonist of the group in Dougray Scott, but even Tom Cruise, I would say, isn't completely exempt from criticism for Mission Impossible 2. As great of a character as Ethan Hunt was in the first film, he feels radically different in the sequel. Even aesthetically, from the sunglasses to the leather, he has this romantic love triangle here. It's an odd period of time where it kind of just feels like we were leaning heavily into trying to make Ethan Hunt James Bond when he isn't James Bond. He's Ethan Hunt, a completely different character, and I'm glad as the films went on, we kind of moved away from trying to make Mission Impossible the American James Bond. So this is an entry we kind of, as fans, sweep under the rug. There's some fun moments here, but largely it's kind of forgettable. In 6th place, I have Mission Impossible 3. As mixed as I was on Mission Impossible 2, I am quite glad that Mission Impossible 3 kind of got things back on track, ramping up the overall stakes and emotions within the story for Ethan as a character. Gone now, thankfully, is the James Bond inspiration for Ethan Hunt. He's much more his own character. He even has a wife in this entry. The true elements to Mission Impossible 3, though, I think help it excel is its fast pace and the action all around. As divisive as the filmmaker J.J. Abrams would become after Mission Impossible 3, I actually think this is a pretty solid directorial debut for him. There were crazy action moments in the first 2 Mission Impossible films, but I think 3 is when we started to see the spectacle of it all get bigger and bigger, because Mission Impossible 3 has tons of spectacular stunts in this mission that ramp up in intensity and never really stop. It kind of sacrifices character work, unfortunately, for the sake of all of this big bombastic action, which is kind of a big knock on the film. We don't get to really know a whole lot about these characters or even the villain in Philip Seymour Hoffman. Even regardless of that fact, though, that we don't know a whole lot of backstory about the villain of the film, Philip Seymour Hoffman's performance is spectacular. He's probably one of my favorite villains of the entire franchise just due to his demeanor. It's certainly not a perfect entry, but I can throw it in and be very entertained, and you can even see the building blocks here to form that foundation on what makes a great Mission Impossible film. In 5th place, I have Mission Impossible. Despite this first Mission Impossible being much more subdued compared to the later entries, that's actually an aspect I quite enjoy about this first film, because the first Mission Impossible, I think, is a genuinely solid thriller. This film makes great use of suspense and mysterious atmosphere to build up tension within its story, and the action and pretty much everything about this I think still holds up quite well. A lot of which I think that can be attributed to the direction of Brian De Palma. In retrospect, it's kind of wild looking back at this first Mission Impossible, because this really was the beginning of Tom Cruise becoming this big action movie star, and you can see why he became this big action movie star, because he completely nails it as the character of Ethan Hunt. Even in this first film, I think he's a fantastic protagonist due to his relatability, and that relatability I think makes him a much more interesting character to follow along on this mission, as he does have to come into his own as a spy and do all this awesome spy stuff, whether it's the amazing train sequence or hanging by the rope trying not to touch the ground, all while this amazing music's playing in the background. I almost forgot that Danny Elfman was the one that scored the very first Mission Impossible amongst his many other amazing film scores. The biggest knock, though, for me when it comes to this first Mission Impossible film is the film overall, story-wise. It's a bit convoluted, it's a bit hard to follow. If you think too much about the plausibility in this spy adventure and and everything unfolding with Jim Phelps, it can be sort of a headache to follow. I do think it is pretty cool that we actually integrated Jim Phelps into the film. Of course, it's not Peter Graves, instead it's Jon Voight, but it's cool that there is that link between the show from the 60s and the film series. Still, regardless, I have a really fun time whenever I revisit the first Mission Impossible. As I said, it holds up pretty well, and it's a good start to an iconic franchise of films that are still ongoing almost 30 years later. In fourth place, I have Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. With this installment, it feels like we have perfected the formula, so everything about Rogue Nation is such a blast watching Ethan and his team going up against the Syndicate. One of the biggest things that I love most about Rogue Nation is I quite enjoy the overall team dynamic within this mission, particularly since it does evoke the tense espionage vibes that I enjoy the most. Also, Rogue Nation has one of my favorite additions to the cast in Rebecca Ferguson. I love Rebecca Ferguson. I think she's one of the best additions to this cast of characters in Ethan's group. She's a massive scene stealer. She's beautiful. She kicks so much ass in every scene that she's in. Of course, now we've seen Christopher McQuarrie direct multiple Mission Impossible films, but this is the first one that he directed in the franchise, and I think he did a great job. I actually quite love his direction. His style just works perfectly when it comes to framing these elaborate action set pieces and huge stunts to get the most edge of your seat intensity. Whether it's the airplane stunt, the stuff underwater, or the motorcycle stuff, all of it is firing on all cylinders, and it's why I think this franchise almost gets better every single entry. In third place, I have Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. Even though I mostly enjoyed all of the entries leading up to Ghost Protocol I think is the entry where they really figured out the formula and refined all the elements that make these movies spectacular. It has a lot of great edge-of-your-seat thrills in the action category, but balances it out well with a strong team dynamic due to the IMF and due to the fact that Ghost Protocol is enabled, I do think that allows the story to have a level of urgency, a sense of tension, but also a lot of humor, because a good amount of the time in the movie, their gadgets just don't work, or they break. In similar fashion to how I felt about the new additions in Rogue Nation with Rebecca Ferguson, I think the additions in Ghost Protocol are also pretty good, especially Jeremy Renner, who I do wish he had continued on to be in more of the sequels after these only couple. He was only in this one in Rogue Nation. Even Paul Patton, though. Paul Patton was only in this film, and I feel like she could have also been pretty great if we kept her on. I actually think it's pretty fun and inspired, the fact that Brad Bird directed Ghost Protocol, because most people were associating him with Disney Pixar films, whether it's The Incredibles or The Iron Giant. Usually he does animation, but I quite liked his approach to Ghost Protocol, and it makes me wish he would direct more live-action films, especially in the action genre. He handles all the action set pieces and stunts perfectly. The cinematography is phenomenal, especially in the Dubai chase or when Ethan's climbing the Burj Khalifa. All of that stuff is nerve-wracking to watch. Sure, the overall story at this is pretty simple at large and straightforward, with Cobalt wanting the nuclear codes, and he isn't the most interesting villain by any means, but the intrigue and the suspense are on point here, along with some phenomenal action, so it's one of the sequels that I have the most fun with. In second place, I have Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. This film and my number one, it's neck and neck. Both of them are phenomenal films in their own right, and I do think they could very much easily swap in the future, but I was completely blown away by pretty much everything in Dead Reckoning Part 1. I don't know how Tom Cruise and company keep finding ways to push the envelope on intense, edge-of-your-seat action, but it succeeds in doing so with the set pieces sprinkled throughout this in Rome, the hand-to-hand stuff, and the train sequence. All of it is perfectly shot. And once again, in Part 1 of Dead Reckoning, I think the overall story is extremely fascinating and topical, given the fact that Ethan and his team are going up against a real fear that's currently ongoing, so the stakes are high. The new cast overall is spectacular. I still think my favorites all around are Haley Atwell and Pom Klementieff, two fantastic additions who both ironically are from the MCU. Practically everything is superb about Dead Reckoning Part 1, even though the story isn't completely finished that they're building up because it is a Part 1. I still think overall I left satisfied, and I cannot wait to see where we take everything in Part 2. But at number 1, I have Mission Impossible Fallout. Easily by far, in my opinion, it's perfection. Everything from the action, the stunts, the cinematography, it is the quintessential action blockbuster of the summer, and it has all of the great edge-of-your-seat insane action that blows your mind, and you have no idea how everybody was able to pull off these kind of stunts. Some of the wild stuff they pull off in Fallout are only things that people like Christopher McQuarrie or Tom Cruise would even try and cook up, like the halo jump sequence, the helicopter fight, coupled with all of the usual staples of a Mission Impossible film, with the thrilling chases on foot and the brutal brutal fights like the one in the bathroom that has Henry Cavill's character in it, who, by the way, another fantastic addition to the franchise. His mustache is glorious. It's truly a shame that they decided to kill him off, or, I guess we'll see maybe if he comes back, but I mean, he pretty much probably died. I mean, let's be real. Basically, Fallout has some of my favorite stunts of the entire franchise, along with one of the stories I find the most fascinating to watch unfold. I love how it utilizes familiar archetypes that fans are familiar with on all of these different missions with Ethan, and then flipping them all around to maximize our intrigue and boost the tension even more. Even if necessarily we kind of saw some of the twists coming. And even though this franchise isn't really known at all for having great villains, I think between this film and 3, it has some of the best villains by far. And it's crazy to think that this is 7 entries in now, this one being the 6th, and usually by this time a franchise loses steam, but it seems like with the Mission Impossible franchise, it's just getting bigger and better almost every single entry, and I love it. If they can somehow continue to blow my mind with each entry, I'm down. Make as many of these films as you want. But there you have it. That is my ranking of all of the Mission Impossible films so far, from worst to best. It's been a lot of fun discussing the Mission Impossible franchise with you guys, but like I said before, make sure you share your ranking of the franchise down below in the comment section. As part of the fun is to have the conversation with you guys in the comment section down below, and I'm sure that everyone's ranking is going to be very different, and that's what makes this so fun to talk about. Anyways, thank you guys as always for the videos. I always do appreciate it. Make sure to like on the video and also subscribe to the channel so you update reviews, reactions, unboxings, rankings, and more. For next time, I'll see you guys later.